Accuses the U.S. of committing piracy. Iranians rally in the capital, Tehran, dismissing threats by the U.S. president to block the Strait of Hormuz.
Conditions, no tolls, and no tolerance of Iran holding the world's economy to ransom.
Now the UK, along with other NATO allies, refuse to join the U.S. blockade on Iran's ports and say they will not be drawn into the conflict. Bearing the brunt of war, Lebanon's healthcare workers are doing their best to treat the wounded by Israel's invasion in the south. U.S. President Donald Trump says that a military blockade of Iranian ports is now in effect. U.S. Central Command says it will be enforced on vessels of all nations entering and exiting Iran's ports and coastal areas. Talks between Washington and Tehran ended without a breakthrough in Pakistan. But speaking at the White House on Monday, Trump maintains they're speaking to the so-called right people in Iran who still want to make a deal. Al Jazeera's chief U.S. correspondent Alan Fisher has the latest from Washington.
I think you voted for me, do you think?
A staged event, a fast food delivery. And Donald Trump still believes he can deliver a peace deal with Iran.
We've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal. They would like to work a deal.
More than 20 hours of talks in Pakistan at the weekend brought no breakthrough. Lots of agreement, we're told, but one crucial sticking point for the American side and the president.
You marking it down? Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
Trump's comments came just hours after the US Navy began a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. The focus, ships coming in and out of Iranian ports. The White House wants to choke Iran off from world markets to essentially stop it making money from its energy industry. Its intention is to put pressure on the likes of China, which imports a third of its oil needs from Iran, to put pressure and use its influence to get Tehran back to the negotiating table. Trump says he couldn't allow Iran to charge for using the strait. Extortion, he called it. And he insists the blockade is working.
So now Iran is doing absolutely no business, and we're going to keep it that way very easily. Don't forget, their Navy is gone, their Air Force is gone, their anti-aircraft is gone, their radar is gone, and their leaders are gone. Thank you very much, everybody.
For now, the ceasefire is holding. Neither side is saying they're done with the process.
You want to come in for a second?
But with Trump threatening to obliterate any Iranian ship that comes near the blockade, the fear is the two countries could easily reignite this conflict. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, at the White House.
Well, the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has told U.S. media that the ball is in Iran's court to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and see progress in stalled peace talks. Vance was in Pakistan over the weekend for talks with Tehran, brokered by Islamabad. Now, while it didn't end in a breakthrough, the possibility of future talks remains on the table. John Holman reports from Washington.
The plan for the United States with its blockade of Iranian vessels and vessels that have docked at Iranian ports going through the Strait of Hormuz seems clear. It wants to put pressure on Iran. It wants to put economic pressure on Iran to come to the negotiating table. More than 50% of Iran's exports are oil, and it makes up a huge part of the Iranian government's revenue. So this will really put the squeeze on them. And what President Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance has said is that they're only doing to Iran what Iran has done to many of the other countries in the rest of the world. They call it economic terrorism. Basically, they say that Iran's been putting the squeeze on other countries by not allowing their oil and their vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Well, now it's Iran's turn to face the same sort of thing. This is actually what J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, had to say about it.
We need to see the Straits of Hormuz fully open. And this is frankly one of the things where the Iranians tried to move the goalposts during the negotiation. We made very clear that that's unacceptable. We came to the negotiation saying the United States, what we've given here is a ceasefire. We've stopped bombing the country. What we expect the Iranians to give up is a full reopening of the Straits of Hormuz. We have seen, as the president has said,
also had some positive things to say about the talks that happened in Islamabad in Pakistan on the weekend. He said that they didn't get there, but he said that there was a grand deal that could be done, and he thought that that still might be able to be done. He said that the Iranian delegation, that he thought it was best they went back to Tehran to seek approval or authorization for the things that the United States were putting on the table, whilst he and his delegation went back to Washington, D.C. Top of the list for the US still seems to be that Iran doesn't seek to develop a nuclear weapon and actually hands across, presumably to the United States, its highly enriched uranium. Vice President Vance said that they expected that to be out of the country, and that was one of the things that the United States absolutely needed. So he was also asked if there would be a second round of those negotiations, and he didn't rule it out, but he said the ball now was in Iran's court. So it seems that parallel to the blockade, at least some level of talking between the two countries is going on to see if there might be an actual end that can be brought to this conflict. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Washington, D.C.
Well, the US military says that the blockade applies to all of Iran's ports that stretch from the Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. Vessels traveling between the non-Iranian ports will be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The vital waterway transported around a fifth of global oil supplies, but it's effectively been blocked by Iran since the start of the war over 6 weeks ago. And now Tehran has responded with threats of its own against all ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
The criminal America's restriction on the movement of maritime vessels in international waters is an illegal act and an example of piracy. The armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran explicitly and resolutely declares that the security of ports in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman is either for everyone or for no one. If the security of the ports of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman is threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman will be safe.
Well, thousands have rallied in the Iranian capital in support of the Iranian government and against the US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Pictures have emerged of crowds cheering, holding up their torchlights and parading the national flag late into the evening. Demonstrators denounced the acts and words of US President Donald Trump, with some saying they are not afraid.
First, you make many threats and carry out none of them. And even if your threats are carried out, we know that our country's armed forces will fully respond to them. We are present in these streets to support our country's system and its armed forces. And under our support, they will fully carry out their duty.
Trump said he would strike many of our power plants and our infrastructure. He said many strange things. He said he would come and take one of our islands, but none of his promises were fulfilled. This is just another promise like the others. All of them are empty. We're not afraid of his threats, and we have no fear at all.
The US blockade of the Strait means it will be much harder for Iran to sell oil at a time when the economy is ravaged by the war and years of sanctions. From Tehran, here's Al Jazeera's Ali Hashim.
We're currently dealing with two rhetorics. The Iranian rhetoric that stresses it's defending itself against the American war, American-Israeli war, and the American rhetoric that's saying also, as we heard from Washington, that they're not going to accept that Tehran blackmails the war. But the issue right now is that the strait is closed. Regardless of who is closing the strait, whether it's the Iranian blockade or the American blockade, the strait is closed. And this will have serious implications on the global economy. Now, this plays into the hands of Tehran because this is what they wanted from the beginning when they started launching rockets and drones towards the Gulf countries and oil facilities, and later on closing the strait. So now this is playing into their hands. However, yes, there is a big question how much Iran can stay without selling oil the way it used to sell. Now, we know that Iran over the past years was under pressure, under sanctions, and it created several and different ways to sell its oil in a way that it could not be discovered. So we know also that most of the Iranian oil is sold outside the Strait of Hormuz and not inside the Strait of Hormuz. So now it's a matter of who shouts first, the Americans or the Iranians. There's a very strong possibility that there are going to be meetings on the expert level and that mediations are going on, especially from countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and there are other mediators also that are in the middle of this process. Now, what we understood is that there are issues that could have been solved during the Islamabad talks. And there was a framework that they almost announced, but later on it seems that the United States took a decision to leave. But now, given the fact that many interventions are going on, and there is actually a will from both the United States and Iran not to resume the war.
Well, Douglas Guilfoyle is a specialist in international law and maritime security at the University of New South Wales. He says blockade as a tool of economic warfare has serious consequences for civilians.
If you're in an international armed conflict with another state, you can blockade its ports, prevent its ships or other ships entering or leaving its ports as a measure of what's called economic warfare. So this has been seen in major international conflicts at sea for a very long time. So it's something that international law acknowledges can happen during a war. International law acknowledges that during an international armed conflict, blockade is a potential tool of economic warfare. It has a number of important limitations. One is that neutral trade that doesn't connect with Iran should be allowed through, and the Americans have said that they'll allow that to happen. Another important limitation is that for a blockade to be legal, it must be effective, and it must be applied against all vessels. So we've only heard so far of one vessel successfully making it through the blockade. So that sounds like an effective blockade. But the third critical point is that it does not have the consequence of starving the civilian population or denying them access to, say, vital food and medicine. Now, that's obviously been the criticism of Israel's blockade, for example, of Gaza. So we have to see how this blockade plays out in practice. But so far, it would appear that the Americans are, as it were, doing this by the book.
Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer says the UK's Navy will not be part of the US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Starmer says his country will not be dragged into the war. He's holding a summit with dozens of countries later this week to ensure the waterway remains open once the war ends. Rory Challens has more from London.
Keir Starmer's twin challenge is to keep the UK out of this war, not our conflict, not in the national interest, as he's put it, but also to avoid antagonising Donald Trump any more than he already has. And in that, he has failed. The US president has repeatedly criticised Keir Starmer, essentially calling him a weakling, saying that he doesn't measure up to the previous residents of this property, like Winston Churchill. But Keir Starmer is focused on trying to build an international coalition to reopen the Straits of Hormuz once the fighting has finished. Here's how he put that to Parliament earlier.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The summit will be focused on two things. First, diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the strait to be opened. Second, military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established.
Now, next door to where the Prime Minister lives at number 10 Downing Street is number 11, where the Chancellor lives. And like many finance ministers around the world, Rachel Reeves has her work cut out. Oil is back above $100 a barrel. Stock markets are weakening. Government bonds are weakening. And it's easy to see why. With the talks failing and the Trump blockade, we're now looking at a prolonged energy shock with inflation and low growth. A UK think tank called the Resolution Foundation has said that the average UK household is going to be £480 worse off. That's about $680 because of this war. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera in London.
The ceasefire in Lebanon has been one of the main points of contention during the negotiations between the US and Iran. Israeli and Lebanese officials are expected to meet for talks in Washington on Tuesday. At the same time, the Israeli army has intensified ground operations in southern Lebanon. The military carried out a strike near the entrance to the Red Cross office in the southern city of Tyre, killing one person. The victim was a wounded person being transported for treatment. It was a second attack on the Red Cross in less than 24 hours. Elsewhere in southern Lebanon, the Israeli military has demolished a residential building in the town of Nakura, also in the Tyre district. On Monday, Israeli ground forces pushed further into Lebanese territory, seizing several towns. One of those towns is Bint Jbeil, which has been a Hezbollah stronghold. Now, Hezbollah Secretary General has rejected the upcoming talks between the Lebanese government and Israel. Naim Qassem says the talks are a ploy to pressure Hezbollah into laying down its weapons.
We reject negotiations with the Israeli entity. These negotiations are futile and require a Lebanese consensus to shift our approach from non-negotiation to direct negotiations. What is this humiliation that Lebanon is facing directly? Israel says very clearly these negotiations are to force Hezbollah to disarm their weapons and to have peace with the Israeli enemy. Netanyahu has repeated this several times.
Well, Lebanon's health ministry says more than 2,000 people have been killed and more than 6,000 injured by Israeli strikes since the beginning of March. The attacks have caused a surge in patients with burn injuries. Lebanon's public health services lacked the specialized medical care to treat them. Al Jazeera's Malcolm Webb reports from a burns unit in the city of Sidon. Just a warning that some viewers may find the images in his report distressing.
This man hasn't been able to walk for the last 8 months. He told us he's a policeman and he was on duty when he was targeted by an Israeli missile in southern Lebanon. It was during the last ceasefire. Now he's receiving specialized treatment at this burns unit in the city of Sidon. He hopes he'll walk again. In the next cubicle, Kamal Fakir has burns on 60% of his body. He told us when the Israeli military ordered everyone to leave his village, he stayed because it's his home and his right. Then came the bombs.
We heard, for a fraction of a second, the sound of the missile approaching. At this moment, you feel like you're electrocuted. I fainted. I opened my eyes and realized we've been bombed and we were under the rubble. I heard people screaming. The rescue team was just on its way, but the Israelis started to fire missiles on them. They hid, but then they came back and pulled us out and took us to the hospital.
An Israeli bomb hit this building last month, killing a child inside one of the apartments. It's in a densely populated neighborhood of Beirut. The medics say it's almost impossible to survive a direct hit, but people a few meters away can survive with life-changing burns. The boy's father said he went back inside to try and help him. He was burned and he was treated by the medics at the burns unit. They say they're receiving patients with multiple kinds of injuries caused by devastating aerial weapons every day. Permanent loss of mobility and other lasting effects of severe burns can be prevented with specialist treatment that Lebanon's public health service struggles to provide. The burns unit's been set up by a medical charity called Interburns. Most of the staff here say they've seen injuries like this before, working in Gaza. That's where Dr. Mohamed Ziara grew up. After qualifying as a plastic surgeon in Egypt, he went back to help. He says 7 of his colleagues were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Gaza hospital where he worked, and he sees similarities with what's happening here in Lebanon.
Many of the medical staff been targeted recently in many areas in the south mainly. So it's basically the same. Maybe the numbers in Gaza is unmatched. The medical staff were targeted all the time. It's not easy to see this. What I can do is just keep going, helping people that need help wherever they are.
Israel's military says its targets are Hezbollah's fighters and infrastructure without providing evidence. It's also said it will repeat its destruction of Gaza here in Lebanon. Dr. Ziara says he can't go home, but he won't stop treating the people who need his help. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Lebanon.
OK, you're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Aline Saeed. A reminder of our top stories this hour. A US blockade of Iranian ports is now in effect. That's according to Donald Trump. US Central Command says ships transiting to and from Iranian ports will be intercepted. Iran has threatened to retaliate, saying that the US blockade now threatens the safety of ports in the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. The Revolutionary Guard says US military vessels in the Strait of Hormuz will be met with a forceful response. The Israeli army has intensified ground and air operations